All right, good morning, everybody. Today, I want to discuss the topic of young Earth creationism and just that whole topic in general. How we should view the origins of the universe, how we should view creation, and then I want to kind of lay out my position on this issue and kind of where I am, at least currently. So, first off, I want to make it clear. The Catholic Church has not given an official declaration on this issue. So, you're able to believe a myriad of opinions. The only boundary markers that I know of were set down by, I believe it was Pius XII in his encyclical Humanae Generis, which means on human origins, basically, where he says that Catholics must believe at least that there was an actual first human male and an actual first human female. We can't believe that that there was just a multitude of human beings initially. Now, one can kind of parcel this out and say, there could be multiple humanoids, right? Like you could potentially make the distinction that, say, Neanderthals or other types of Homo sapien-like creatures. You could make the argument that they were not actually human beings in the fullest of that sense. Like they didn't have rationality, basically. And that God would have potentially have infused rationality into the first human beings, namely Adam and Eve. Now, the church has also made clear you don't have to believe specifically that the first human was named Adam and the first man was named Adam and the first woman was named Eve. I mean, Adam in Hebrew just means man. So, you don't have to take the absolute details of the story necessarily, right? So the church has laid out some parameters on this issue, but there's wiggle room there, right? So if you're convinced by the theory of evolution, there's nothing wrong with that. If you're convinced with the more 7-day literal creation, or even somewhere in between, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that either, as long as you believe that there were originally two human beings, a male and a female, and that the humankind can relate their progeny back to those human beings. Now, I also want to discuss what some other options would be here, because there are a multitude of options that one could take, and I'm not going to give an exhaustive list here. I can't think of an exhaustive list because of it's kind of up to the human imagination at this point. And to me, that's the human imagination plays a big role in this issue in general. But I'll get to that eventually. So, there could be many different ways one could look at this. One could say, maybe there were pre-human animals that looked like humans for the most part, but they just didn't have rational souls. They hadn't reached that level of intellection or rationality, and thus, they were not human in the fullest of the sense. They weren't rational beings. Now, to me, one problem with that solution is that it kind of assumes that the soul is something that's like an afterthought to the body. That the soul is, not the form of the body, but it's like some other substance that God can just put into the body, as a ghost goes into a machine. And as I've talked about a lot on this show, I find that view very problematic. So at least from like a philosophical view, I see a lot of issues with that kind of a view. Now, it could be that, it's not necessarily that God, took an existing human being and infused the soul in them. It could be that, maybe similar to what happened to Mary in her conception, in her immaculate conception, that God, at the very beginning, at the very conception of Adam and of Eve, he infused a rational soul, or not infused, but just allowed a rational soul to be created via the body's development. Like it could have been some sort of miracle, basically, in the human body that allowed the brain to have the capacity for rationality as it's being formed, and thus, you have a rational being, right? Because in my view, I take a much more physicalist view than a lot of people would, even among Catholic circles, right? I think that I really do think that we are our bodies, and that our souls are just the form of our bodies. Like our matter comes first. I mean, they're simultaneous, but I would think the emphasis would be that the form of our body kind of comes from the matter, just like the form of a house comes from the matter of a house when it's composed into a certain form, right? So that's kind of my view as of now, right? So this is how I would kind of approach this problem, and how I look at it. Because again, I do think there's issues with thinking that God just infused the soul into an already existing human body to make it rational. I'm not convinced that that's how rationality works. I think rationality has to do more with the forming of the body than it does with some sort of soul substance that is, an afterthought. Okay. But again, I might be wrong on all this, and this is murky waters, so we have room to play around with these things as long as we stay within the bounds that Holy Church has set. So, I mean, you can't believe that, there were multiple first human beings per se, and that the actual first man and first woman never existed. You can't really believe in that. To my knowledge. I mean, I know that there have been some people recently who have said that there are workarounds around that, around Humanae Generis and what the Pope has said there, but I'm so far not convinced. That seems to be a pretty high-level magisterial proclamation based upon the verbiage that he uses in there. I would say it's pretty close to an infallible declaration, but again, I'm not a theologian, so I can't make that determination. And even an individual theologian can't make that determination. So, anyway, I'm just trying to lay out here for you guys how kind of problematic both sides of this view are. I see a lot of problems with the view that tries to make evolution fit into the biblical narrative, into the historical narrative that Christians have taken throughout Christian history, generally at least. I mean, St. Augustine did have, in his work, The City of God, he said things like, it's, and I'm paraphrasing here, but, it's not absolutely necessary that there was some sort of 7-day creation, right? And Origen, in his first homily on Genesis, says, that he takes a much more symbolic view of this issue. So it's not like everybody took a literal view of the 7 days of creation, but it also, it definitely doesn't mean that they took an evolutionary view of this issue. So, okay, so there's some of my problems with the more evolutionist side of this issue, and now let's go to the creationist side. What do I see as issues there? I think first off, sometimes creationists, I think, can take things too literally. If you're taking it as a literal 7-day creation, that there's no wiggle room. It happened exactly as the first few chapters of Genesis said. I think that is quite foolish because it doesn't take into account the type of writing that Genesis is. I mean, it's quite clear that I think most of the book of Genesis has a lot of typological things within it, where there can be lots of connections between the Old Testament and the New Testament and various parts of the Old Testament and Genesis, and it's very clear that it was written after the fact. I mean, I believe that Moses wrote the 5 books of the Pentateuch. Now, they may have been revised here and there throughout Jewish history, right? But I do believe that Moses wrote those books. I'm convinced of that evidence at this point. But so he would have been writing what? many, many hundreds of years after the fact, at least. So these are stories that had been passed down through generations. And granted, people were very, very good at storytelling because the written language hadn't really been concretized yet, right? Abraham was from a part of Samaria, which was one of the first civilizations that we have record of that had some sort of writing. So, Abraham was living at a time when writing was just coming into being, as far as we know. So, they had a lot, the only way they could transmit things before then, as far as we know, was through oral transmission. And, in human life, there are lots of things that are incredibly important that you need a very good memory to transmit them to your children. A very practical one would be property lines. You need a way to transmit where those things are to your children. This has been something that has been around for all of human history. Where's my property? Where's your property? I'm a land surveyor, so this is something that I'm keenly aware of, right? This has been around for all of human history. That's a very particular issue that needs to be transmitted in a very particular way. And before you have real concretized writing systems, the best and only way to do that was by oral transmission, right? And maybe some sort of evidence, putting rocks on the ground or some sort of stakes in the ground, fences, things like that. So yeah, you need. I'm just saying. I think ancient people were much, much better at the game of telephone than we are today. So I think when people play that game and they say, "See how terrible we are at transmitting information via oral methods," right? Oral transmission. Oral tradition, right? See how horrible oral tradition is? I think that really is a horrible example, because today we don't really value oral tradition because everything's written down. We have a better way of doing it. But when you live in a society where people don't have the ability to write things down at all, or the vast majority of people aren't literate and can't write, oral tradition takes a much more serious position in in human affairs, right? So where am I going with this? Because I'm trying to remind myself here, where am I going with this? That all comes down to say that I think that Moses certainly had a good understanding of these things that were passed down to him, including the stories, the legends, the myths, whatever you want to say about them, of Genesis, and particularly of the first 3 chapters, right? And I think it's very true that Genesis is not a science textbook. I think everybody can agree upon that. I just read Origen's first homily on Genesis a few days ago, and he makes that explicitly clear, that Genesis, particularly those first few chapters, they're not a science textbook, right? Their primary mode is to explain what God did, not scientifically, and not like historically per se, but in a literary type of a fashion, in a way that demonstrates the beauty of God's love for creation. So I do think that the absolute literal positions on creation have problems as well, just for interpretation of the text. I think it's quite problematic when we take every bit of scripture absolutely literally. I mean, nobody does that. We pick and choose which ones we want to take literally based upon evidence and based upon, prior knowledge, basically. So now, that does, I do think the primary mode that we should be interpreting scripture is literal, but when it doesn't seem clear to us that a literal interpretation is the right one, I don't think that there's any reason we have to take it literally, right? The literal translation should be our default, but that doesn't mean we translate everything literally. You know what I'm saying? I hope I'm making that clear. There's distinctions here. There's subtlety here that's important, I think. So how does this kind of all come down? How am I viewing this issue? Well, first off, I want to just make it utterly clear again. You can take that there's a large breadth of opinion that people can have on this issue and still be within the realm of Catholicity, right? You can take an absolutely literal position on this. You can. I don't think it's the most prudent thing to do, but you can definitely do that. I also, you can also take a pretty evolutionary view on this issue as well. There's obviously limits, and I've laid a lot of those down. And again, this is a live issue within the church, so there may come out to be more boundary lines on that issue than there are right now. So where do I come down on this? Well, I'm basically agnostic on the issue. I don't know. And here's my defense for that. And I'm going to take it in the two kind of fashions. And both of them come from the same idea. And this idea is we weren't there. So we don't know. We weren't there, so we don't know. All of our evidence is can be called into question. All of the scientific evidence in favor of evolution can easily be called into question. We're making these assumptions based upon data way after the fact, and we're taking these pieces of evidence and we're saying, this looks like it leads to this conclusion. It doesn't mean that it leads to that conclusion. It means that it just appears to lead to the conclusion of evolution, right? We see, in fossil evidence, in genetic evidence, that it's kind of pointing us towards this conclusion of evolution, right? But then again, I hear a lot of creationists, and they make some good points that over the last 150 years, science coming from a creationist standpoint has not been given enough funding and enough options to actually do the research necessary to actually make a scientific case for their position. You need a lot of funding for these sorts of scientific issues, and I've heard this point particularly from one person that I want to give a shout out to, and that would be Gideon Lazar with the Byzantine Scotus YouTube channel. So I want to give a shout out to him. I want to give credit to him for that argument, and I'm sure he probably got it from somewhere else, I would imagine. He is a very smart guy, but most of us get things from other people. If he did come up with that on his own, that's amazing. Good job, Gideon. But I want to give credit where credit's due. So, and he gave that, I saw him give that defense in a debate with Jimmy Akin that he had over this issue. It was like an intra-Catholic debate on the issue of creationism, right? It was a very good debate. It was on Pints with Aquinas, so if you want to look that debate up, I would highly suggest it. It's pretty long. I think it was like 2 hours or something. So, carve out some time for it. But I thought it was very good. And I thought Gideon made some very, very good points. I had heard, the evolutionary sort of leaning Catholic standpoint a lot. But I hadn't heard a lot of Catholics seriously defend the creation, the more creationist view. And I think he did make some good points. So, for me, basically what it comes down to is we weren't there. And I think one point for the creationists is that, we do have historical evidence of, some sort of creationist view, namely in the book of Genesis and in many other writings, religious writings throughout history. And I think that those things, they shouldn't be dismissed just because they're religious. Those sorts of writings, they shouldn't be dismissed just because they're religious. That shows a ton of bias, I believe. If one is just going to dismiss certain very key bits of historical evidence just because of where they come from, right? That's like a logical. It's like the historical version of the ad hominem logical fallacy. You're just dismissing someone's argument because of what they are, right? In this way, a historian would be dismissing historical evidence because of its origin, right? It's like a genetic fallacy, basically, I guess is probably a better way to put it. So, I just think that this issue is much more complex and much larger than a lot of people make it out to be. Ultimately, I look at things mostly from a philosophical point of view, and philosophically, I don't have epistemic satisfaction on this issue. So what that means is I don't have correct understanding of this issue to make a conclusion, and I also not convinced of the knowledge that I have of this issue to make a conclusion. And so therefore, I'm going to abstain from belief on this issue. I do think that this issue, at least from a philosophical standpoint, comes down to belief ultimately. Comes down to faith. Because, what is our definition of faith that we talked about a few episodes ago? It's that you have evidence and it points you towards a conclusion, right? But then you have to kind of make that jump. And I think on certain things, it's definitely necessary to have faith. It's necessary to have faith on the philosophical origins of everything, on that absolutely looking back and saying, where did everything come from? Did it come from an unmoved mover, an eternal one, or did it come from, is the universe just eternal? I do think that is something that one has to make a leap of faith on and make a choice on. And there are probably other options one could take, obviously, on that issue. But one makes that leap of faith for because of what kind of effects that sort of a belief will have on the rest of one's life. That's a core belief of humanity, and I think all human beings need to take a stance on that issue. So I think agnosticism on that issue can be quite problematic because it leaves you kind of in limbo on everything else. But on the origins of the universe specifically, on how it came about, at least from a Catholic standpoint, I know it came about by God. And I know there was a first human being, a first man and a first woman, right? And so believing that at least, and then being agnostic on the other issues, I don't think that makes I don't think that has bad effects on everything else that I believe. I think that if I believe in those two main things, everything else I believe can be consistent with that. It doesn't matter if I believe in the 7-day literal creation or some sort of amalgamation of evolution and deistic creation, right? I don't think that necessarily matters very much what I believe on that, because it doesn't affect my morality at all. It doesn't affect my it doesn't affect what I believe about myself and others ontologically, what I believe about myself and others like in our being. It doesn't change what I believe, that all human beings are created good, right, and have inherent dignity. That doesn't change what I believe on that issue. Whereas the issue of God, the issue of ultimate origin, would have consequences for what I believe on those sort of issues, and would have consequences for how I act in the world. And so I do think that those types of issues do require a choice in the end. Whereas this one and many others, I think, does not. But I think that's a really good standard if you're looking at hard issues, is to say, does this actually require me to make that leap of faith, that ultimate choice for one conclusion or another? What kind of effects are either conclusion going to have upon my life? Is it going to actually have any practical effects on my life in how I believe about the world? Or is this basically just something that, that doesn't really make any practical effects on how I live my life, right? And I think that is a good determination for when we can be agnostic on an issue and when we have to make an actual choice. So anyway, I hope this helps, guys. I might kind of flesh this out again in another episode, particularly the last point there on when we should be agnostic on issues and when we shouldn't. I think I'll do that because I think that's a very important thing that people need to think about. And because there are plenty of things in life that we can be agnostic on without having to make an absolute decision on. Okay, so alrighty, God bless y'all.